They said the fire could be seen from 3 counties away, a rolling crown of orange and black devouring the dry Texas night. And when Elijah Crow stood barefoot on the gravel road with ash drifting down like diseased snow, he didn't scream or beg or fall to his knees the way the cartel men expected. He just watched his ranch, 3 generations of stubborn black ownership carved out of hostile soil, collapse inward with a sound like the sky breaking. The barn first, then the house, then the long fence line where his grandfather once hammered posts while armed men in white sheets rode by pretending not to see him. And the cartel boss known as El Silencio smiled because he mistook stillness for fear, because he thought the quiet man with the scar on his wrist and the calm eyes was just another rancher who paid late and talked too slow. And when the cartel trucks peeled away leaving a painted threat on a mesquite tree, Elijah picked up a charred horseshoe, turned it over in his hand, and whispered a promise to the dead that sounded like a prayer but felt like a plan. By dawn the sheriff came with apologies and paperwork and the hollow reassurance that justice takes time, and Elijah nodded and signed because he understood time better than anyone, because time was how he survived, how he trained, how he buried his past under a name that never appeared in newspapers, and by noon he was driving east in a borrowed truck, the radio off, the world narrowing to the road and the memories he had spent years locking away, saltwater and steel decks, the thump of rotors at night, the voice of a commander who taught him that violence was a tool, not a feeling, that restraint was a weapon sharper than rage. And when he reached a quiet stretch of coastline and a weathered marina that smelled like fuel and old victories, he dialed a number he hadn't used since a funeral where men who never cried wept behind sunglasses, and the man who answered didn't say hello, just said, "I was wondering when you'd call," and Elijah said, "They burned my family's land." And there was a pause long enough to feel like mercy before the reply came, "Send me the coordinates." Because some bonds are forged in places where promises are written in blood and kept in silence. By nightfall 15 men arrived in 1s and 2s. No fanfare, no uniforms, just ghosts with scars and smiles that didn't reach their eyes, men who had learned Elijah's quiet language when he was still known by a call sign. That meant shadow, men who remembered the night he carried 2 wounded teammates through surf while rounds stitched the water. Men who owed him nothing and everything. And as they sat in a circle under a bare bulb and listened to him tell the story without heat, without adjectives, the way professionals speak when they're deciding whether to cross a line that can't be uncrossed, it became clear this wasn't about revenge but correction, not about killing but ending something that fed on impunity. Because El Silencio's cartel didn't just burn a ranch, it laundered fear into profit. It trafficked lives through dry riverbeds and called it business. And the twist no one expected was that Elijah didn't ask them to fight as Americans but as men bound by a debt to a place where law had failed. And the plan he laid out was surgical and strange, built on patience and misdirection, on turning the cartel's own rituals against them, because Elijah had spent years studying how power moves when it thinks it's untouchable, and the next morning they rode south not as an army but as a caravan of ordinary things. Aid trucks, mechanics, medics, a preacher with a broken Spanish and a better heart. And the border was a line on a map that meant less than the invisible lines drawn by corruption. So when they reached the town where El Silencio ruled from a white compound perched like a tooth on a hill, they didn't announce themselves, they waited, they listened. They watched the way fear flowed from the plaza to the alleys and back again, and here the story bends because the cartel boss had his own intelligence, his own whispers, and by the 3rd night he knew something was wrong, not because men were dying, none were, but because money stopped moving, because drivers quit without explanation, because lieutenants began sleeping with lights on and guns under pillows, because a rumor spread that the quiet black rancher had been someone else once, someone who knew names that shouldn't be known. And El Silencio did what men like him always do when the ground shifts beneath their boots. He escalated, he grabbed a family from the outskirts and made a show of it, and when word reached Elijah, his jaw tightened just once, and he changed the plan in a way that saved lives but cost him something he had hoped never to spend, because the next move required revealing himself to the one person who could end this without a massacre. The colonel who controlled the region's special police. A woman whose brother Elijah had saved years ago in a night operation no one admitted happened. And when Elijah walked into her office unarmed and placed photographs on her desk, of accounts, of routes, of men shaking hands with devils, the colonel understood that this wasn't an invasion but an intervention, and she agreed to act if Elijah could deliver El Silencio without blood in the streets. Which is, when the final twist clicked into place. The cartel boss believed power was fire, visible and terrifying, but Elijah understood power as water, patient and relentless, and on the night of the festival when fireworks split the sky and the town looked up, 15 shadows moved like a thought through corridors that had never known consequence, cutting power not to plunge the compound into darkness but to light it differently, opening doors instead of kicking them, turning guards into witnesses. And, when El Silencio found himself alone in his office with a man he thought he had broken, Elijah didn't draw a weapon. He drew a ledger, the one salvaged from the ashes of his ranch, the one his grandmother had used to write names and debts and prayers, and he told the cartel boss that some fires don't consume, they reveal, and the next day the news spoke of arrests and reforms and a criminal empire folded inward like a bad dream, but it didn't mention 15 Navy SEALs or a quiet black rancher who rode south with them. And weeks later, when Elijah stood on his land again as volunteers raised new posts and planted new trees, he understood that victory wasn't the absence of flames but the presence of community. And as the wind carried the smell of fresh-cut wood instead of smoke, he smiled for the first time since the night everything burned, knowing that the men who rode with him had already vanished back into their lives, leaving behind a lesson written where anyone could read it if they looked hard enough. Underestimate a quiet man at your own peril, because sometimes the ones who lose everything are the ones with nothing left to fear, and when the fire comes, they don't run, they change the world around it.